At this point in the course, our goal is to make sure that you understand how formulas, and in particular sentences that involve letters for names and variables and predicates and quantifiers work, that you know how to figure out when formulas like that are true and false. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go through a number of examples. In each case it'll be a sentence, only sentences are true and false, and your question is going to be, is the sentence true or false? I'll say something about how you figure it out in each case, and then I'd like you to pause the lecture, decide for yourself if you think the sentence is true or false, and then start the lecture again and see if what I have to say in my explanation matches what you thought. So start with this case. We've got an interpretation. It'll be the same interpretation for all of these problems. 6 things in the domain, 1 through 6. It's an F if it's a 1, a 3, or a 5. It's a G if it's a 2, a 4, or a 6, and so on. We know now what F, G, H, J, and K mean. As it turns out in this case, each of the members of the domain has a name. A is 1, B is 2, and so on. So the question is this sentence here true or false? Pause the lecture, decide, and then start again. Well, B refers to the number 2. The number 2 we can see is not an F. So in this case, we know that we've got a conditional with a false antecedent. That already tells us that the conditional is true. We don't even need to think about A and G. So this is an easy one. This was true. Carrying on, this one involves the same skills, it's just that it's slightly more complex. Pause the lecture, decide whether you think this statement is true or false, and then start the lecture again. B once again refers to the number 2. The number 2 is not a K. 5 is the only K, so the first disjunct inside the brackets is false. But G refers to the number 6, and the number 6 is a J, so the second disjunct is true, which means we have a disjunction inside the brackets with the true part. So the disjunction inside the brackets is true. That means that when we deny it, we get a false sentence. So this example is false. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. Now we move on to a quantified example. Here's our example. In fact, we're going to look at what we need to do with the quantified formula. I've sort of gotten us started here. We've got an existentially quantified formula. What are we asking when we ask if it's true? We're asking, is there at least one thing in the domain that fits the description following the quantifier? In other words, that fits this description in this case. So pause the lecture, take a look, and decide, is there anything in the domain that fits this description? If there is, the sentence is true. If there isn't, it's false. Well, to fit this description, the thing that we pick out has to be an F and also has to be an H. In technical talk, that means it satisfies Fx and satisfies Hx. Is there anything that satisfies both of those? Sure, the number 1 does, because it's both an F and an H. So does the number 3. The number 3 is both an F and an H. So there is at least one thing that satisfies this propositional function that fits this description, and therefore the existential statement is true. Carrying on. Here we have a universal statement. For a universal statement to be true, it's got to turn out that every member of the domain fits the description following the quantifier. Here's the description. Here's the propositional function. Does every member of the domain satisfy this propositional function? That is to say, if it satisfies this, then it satisfies this. Or can we find a member of the domain that doesn't? If they all satisfy this, if they all fit this description, then the universal is true. If some of them don't, the universal is false. Pause the lecture, see what you think. Well, think of it this way. Any object we pick is either going to be a J or it isn't. If it's not a J, then it's not going to satisfy Jx, which means it will automatically satisfy the conditional. Satisfaction is just like truth in that way. Something satisfies a conditional if it doesn't satisfy the antecedent or does satisfy the consequent or both. So there's not much point in looking at the things that don't satisfy Jx. They're automatically going to satisfy the conditional. What we need to do is look at the things that do satisfy Jx and see if they all satisfy the conditional. So let's start. Here are the J's. Well, let's start with the number 4. The number 4 satisfies Jx. Does it satisfy Fx? No, it doesn't fit the description is an F. So we have found an object, namely the object 4, that does not satisfy this description. That means the universal is false. The universal is false because there's at least one member of the domain that doesn't fit the description. If it's a J, then it's an F. As we'll make clearer a little bit later when we start talking about symbolization, that'll come next week. An easy way to think of this is as saying all J are F. And if you look up here, it's easy to see that's wrong. It's not true that all J are F. So this is a false universal statement. We've got 2 to look at here. Look at them both. This is not a quantified statement, but it has a quantified statement as a part. Likewise here. So you've got a conditional statement. You have to decide, is the conditional statement true or is it false? Let's start with this one, and then after you've done that, go on and think about this one, and then when you've got both of them clear in your mind, start the lecture up again and we'll talk about them. Okay, start here. B is the number 2. Is B a J? No. So in this case, without even considering the quantified part, we know that we have a true statement because we have a conditional with a false antecedent. But now let's look at this case. F is the number 5. F is a J. So in this case, the antecedent is true. In order to decide if the whole sentence is true, we have to figure out if the consequent is true. If it is, sentence is true. If it's not, sentence is going to be false. For the consequent to be true is for at least one thing to satisfy this propositional function. To fit the description is a K. Are there any Ks? Yeah, there's one. That's all we need. Because there's one thing that fits the description K. The formula here, the sentence here, is true. And so the whole sentence is true. So both of these turned out to be true, but the analysis was not the same in the 2 cases. Now this one's a little bit funny, and I recommend you that you do not try to decide what it means in English. Trying to decide what it means in English is likely to trip you up. Instead, remember how you evaluate an existential. An existential statement is true if the propositional function following the quantifier is satisfied by at least one member of the domain. In other words, this is true if at least one member of the domain fits this description. So pause the lecture and decide, does at least one member of the domain fit this description? The answer is yes. This is true. But you might have gotten fooled at first if you weren't careful. Because if you try to assimilate this to the case of all G or F, you're going to get in trouble. G is the set 2, 4, 6, F is the set 1, 3, 5, and they have no members in common. And that could fool you into thinking that nothing satisfies this description. But that's not right. Take something that's not a G. Take the number 1, for example. In fact, we'll just take its name and plug it in here and see what we get. What we see is that GA arrow FA is true. Why is it true? Because GA is false. Because GA is false, sorry, my spacing has gotten a bit messed up here. My apologies. This is a problem with Microsoft. But what you can see is that GA is false, and so the whole formula here is going to be true. And that means there is at least one member of the domain that satisfies this propositional function, which means that the sum statement, sorry about that, not sure where that came from, the sum statement is true. Last example. We want to know if, we want to know if, I'm going to have to move this down. Microsoft Word is a wonderful thing for some purposes, but by no means for all. Here we are. Okay, we want to know if this statement here is true. What that means is we want to know if every member of the domain fits this description, satisfies this propositional function. Pause the lecture, decide, does every member of the domain fit this description? If the answer is yes, our statement is true. If the answer is no, our statement is false. Okay, well, once again, it won't do us any good to look at things that aren't both F's and G's, because those things will automatically satisfy this propositional function. The interesting case will be where something satisfies both F and Fx and Jx. Are there any such things? F is 1, 3, 5. J is 4, 5, 6. So the number 5 is the only thing in the domain that's both an F and a J. It's the only case where the antecedent of this propositional function is satisfied. Now, if the number 5 is the only thing that satisfies the antecedent here, the next question is, does it satisfy the consequent? The answer is yes, it does. So, the number 5 satisfies this propositional function, and so does everything else. Everything else satisfies it because it doesn't satisfy Fx and Jx. This is very closely related to the point that a conditional with a false antecedent is true. A propositional function that's conditional with an unsatisfied, if it's unsatisfied for a particular object's let's say that again. If I have a conditional propositional function and a particular object doesn't satisfy its antecedent, then that object does satisfy the propositional function. So what we see here is that this is actually true. Another way to think of it, however, would just have been to ask this. Is it true that all FJs are Ks? That's the simple way of reading this. It says that all FJs are Ks. Well, there's only one FJ. That's the number 5. And the number 5 is indeed also a K. So this is true. Pardon me for the little glitches that came up in the recording here. They all had to do with some oddities of Microsoft Word. I suppose I shouldn't be apologizing for Microsoft, but there we go. In the meantime, make sure that you feel comfortable with this. You may want to listen to the lecture again if you're not sure. You may want to make up some examples of your own and see what you think, but we'll spend more time on this because this is important for what's going to be happening later.